A few days ago, Tailspire released on Steam for early access. For those of you who don't know what Tailspire is, it's a digital map-making tool for tabletop role-playing games. So picture Roll20 meets Minecraft. So, of course, for the last week or so, I've been obsessively thinking about what makes a good battle map in Dungeons & Dragons. So my name is Zach Dyson, this is Dungeon Master Design, and today we're talking about how to make interesting and engaging battle maps for your players. Now, of course, Tailspire was the inspiration for this video, but I don't want to talk only about Tailspire. I want to talk universally about what makes a good map, whether you're using pen and paper or a dry erase battle mat or Roll20 or Tailspire or whatever tool you use. The purpose of this video is to help you begin down the creative process to make your own maps that are going to work for you and your players. Inevitably, the problem with any map making process is that eventually you run into the roadblock of staring at the blank screen or staring at the blank page, not knowing where to begin. So in this video, I'm going to present a couple of questions for you to help you start down that creative process and get the ball rolling, making your own maps. The first question that I always ask myself when I start to make a map for Dungeons & Dragons is, do I really need to make this map? In other words, do I need to make this map myself, or is there a resource that I can use that is going to make my life easier? I think often as DMs, we get hung up on the idea that we have to generate all of our own content, make our own adventures, make our own homebrew monsters, make our own battle maps. But that mindset can really lead us to burning ourselves out and no longer enjoying the process of being a DM. So my first tip and the first question that I always ask is, can I use another person's pre-generated map in this scenario? There are plenty of far more talented map makers than me out there. So if there's a map that they've made that works for my situation, I'm going to use their map 9 times out of 10. This has two benefits in my opinion. First, it lets me see what good maps actually look like. It lets me see what works and what doesn't. It lets my players give me feedback on maps that they like and maps that they don't like. And then when it is time for me to make my own maps, I can use that experience and knowledge to my advantage. Secondly, using other people's content, using pre-generated resources, saves me from having to constantly burn myself out making map after map after map. If I use the pre-generated content in the times where I can, it saves my energy so that I can make really excellent maps when I can't. Inevitably, you are going to run into a situation where there isn't an online resource that's going to be useful for you. It doesn't quite meet your standards or it doesn't fit the situation that you're in, so you have to resort to making the map yourself. When that happens, you want to make sure that you have the energy and the creative juice to make the map that you need. But if you've been making map after map week after week, you're not going to have that energy when you need it, and you're going to be let down, and you're going to let your players down, and you're not going to have a fun time in your game. So that's my first tip, is only make maps when you need to make maps and use other people's content when you can't. We're called the D&D community for a reason. A community is supposed to lean on one another, rely on one another, help one another, and there are plenty of people out there whose goal is to do exactly that. Help you have a good time in your D&D game. Now, a bit of a disclaimer here. When I say go out and use other people's content, I do not mean that you should go out and steal other people's content. You should always go through the proper channels to gain access to somebody's artwork or to somebody's pre-generated content or their pre-written adventures or whatever it is that you're using. If they're offering their adventure up for sale, don't try and pirate it for free. Or if they're selling a map online, please don't screenshot the map and then use it in your game. All this does is create animosity in the D&D community, and then eventually those very kind and creative and generous people are going to stop putting their content online, and it's going to make our lives a lot more difficult. So yes, if you're not streaming or publishing your content in some way, please feel free to use other people's content that they've put up online. But please do it responsibly and please do it properly, and please respect the artists and the creative people who have put in the hard work to make that content. So, question 1 was a bit of a cop-out. This is a video talking about how to make your own maps, and question number 1 was don't make your own maps. So question number 2 is going to be far more on topic, and that is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of my players? It's important to ask yourself this as you begin to make a map, because number 1, it may give you some inspiration of what types of things you want to put into your map. And then number 2, it helps you cater that map to your party. No map is going to be one size fits all. A map that's fun for one party is going to be really boring for another party. A map that's challenging for one party is going to be really easy for another party. And that's because no two parties are made up of the same characters, and no two characters have the same set of abilities or advantages or tools at their disposal. Say you have a sneaky rogue with a crossbow bolt. It may be fun and beneficial to put several instances of cover or places to hide on your map so that that rogue can be darting from cover to cover, shooting their crossbow like they're in Gears of War. Additionally, it may give the enemy somewhere to hide so that they're not just shooting at a standing still target. Or maybe you have a sorcerer who can fly. Well, don't give them a bunch of low ceilings and cramped spaces. Give them the ability to take advantage of that spell. Alternatively, maybe your party has some weaknesses. What if your really strong fighter can only fight when they're up close? So maybe you put a chasm in between him and the enemy. Now he has to think of a creative way to overcome that weakness and get to the enemy in order to damage them. Catering to the strengths and weaknesses of your party can really make them feel like they are part of the fight, and it's going to make them really feel like the terrain or the map that they're on really matters. It's not just a blank, empty room. This is a place where they're fighting the enemy. My recommendation is look at all of the characters in your party and begin compiling a list of all of their abilities and all of their weaknesses, all of their advantages and all of their disadvantages. And then when it's time to make a map, you can look at that list and begin combining different abilities and weaknesses or different advantages and disadvantages to make a map that has give and take, ebb and flow. It may be advantageous in one instance, but disadvantageous in another instance. And having that list is going to give you an endless combination of different features and obstacles that you can put in front of the players. The next question to ask when building a map is sort of along the same lines, and that's, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the monsters, or the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy NPCs? Too often, I've seen D&D fights hyped up or presented as really, really scary monsters, or maybe the monster has a really high CR, and then when it's time to fight, the party just surrounds them and beats them to death with their swords. Well, that's usually a problem of terrain. It's usually the fault of the battle map. So for instance, dragons are supposed to be this really scary, fearsome monster, but dragons fall prey to the circle and smash tactic far too often. And the reason for this is we like to put dragons in these really cramped spaces, whether that be a cavern or a treasure trove or whatever it may be. But dragons only really get to shine and really show their fearsomeness when they can fly. That's like a major ability of theirs, is to be able to fly. But how often have you seen a flying dragon in D&D? We give them a huge disadvantage because of the terrain. So it's important to know what exactly the advantages and disadvantages of your monsters are, and also to build a map that either emphasizes their strengths or forces them to interact with their weaknesses. You can turn a really weak and pathetic monster into something particularly fearsome if you give it an environment where it has every advantage. On the other hand, you can take a really fearsome and powerful monster and give the party a fighting chance by putting it in a scenario where it's up against several disadvantages. For instance, a CR5 giant shark could easily tear through a party of level 1 adventurers. But what if that giant shark doesn't have any water to swim through and instead it's in the desert? Well, that's a very easy fight for the party. In the same vein, a CR 1/4 goblin poses no threat to a level 5 party. But what if those goblins have traps set up all around their caverns? They're hiding in the darkness and popping out of hidey holes with surprise attacks. Suddenly, those CR-1/4 monsters become the scariest thing the party has encountered so far, and it's not really certain whether the party's going to survive. Along that same line, looking at a monster's lair actions can also give you good ideas about how to build a map designed for that monster. Many of the monsters in the monster manual have descriptions of what their lairs might look like or what they can do in their lairs. By looking at those descriptions, you can certainly get some inspiration on how to fill in that battle map with different details and obstacles and traps. The next question we should be asking when building a map is, how can I make this battle dynamic? Now, I know that dynamic is sort of a buzzword that gets used a lot, and not just in D&D, but all over the place. But really, all dynamic means is that it's not staying the same. It's changing from round to round. So to make a battle map or an encounter that is dynamic is to make a battle map that's constantly in flux, constantly changing, constantly making the players reassess what the best course of action is. Maybe there's a rushing river next to the battle map, and different objects keep floating down the river and changing the fight. Maybe the party is in a burning building, and every round more and more rubble keeps closing in on the party as the building slowly collapses on them. Maybe there's a series of traps, and a different trap goes off at different points in the initiative, forcing the party to reassess the best place to stand or the place to force their enemy into to get advantage over them. A good dynamic map shouldn't just change or have things happen for no reason. Instead, the purpose of a dynamic map is to cause the party to change what they're doing. The best thing that you can get a party to do is move around the map. Nothing is more boring than standing still and just continually wailing on a monster. But if you need to move or reassess or create a new strategy every round, that's going to be a really fun fight, and it's going to be one that your players remember for a long time. Now, those are a bunch of questions that can get you thinking creatively about the battle maps that you want to create. But now I'm going to give two, tips about what to do once you start making those battle maps. And the first one is think of your battle maps in terms of movements rather than in terms of squares or in feet. So instead of thinking about a 30-foot by 30-foot room, you could think of a room that the players could cross in a single round. It takes one movement to get from end to end. Additionally, instead of a 60-foot room, you could think of a room that takes 2 rounds to get across. The reason that I recommend thinking of your battle maps in this way is because it will change the way you think about how big your environments are. It will give you a reason to make your environment bigger or smaller or longer or skinnier. Rather than simply saying, well, this room, I guess, should be 40 feet long, you can say, I don't want my players to be able to cross this room in a single round, so I'm going to make it longer than 30 feet. Or maybe you want your players to be able to run back and forth in one round, and so you say, I can't make it longer than the average of about 30 feet for a movement speed. This allows you to make your battle maps with a certain amount of intentionality, rather than just guessing at how big a room should be. Now you know that you don't want this room to be bigger or smaller than a certain size. In addition, this also gives the players a modicum of choice. Certain characters have different types of movement speeds with dash actions or bonus action dashes or things like that. And when you think of your rooms in terms of movements, it can offer choices for those players to say, okay, I could either move 30 feet and take a bonus action to hide, or I could move 30 feet and take a bonus action to get to the other side of the room. It offers choice. And that brings us to the second tip that I would give you when building a battle map, and that's to build in a certain amount of player choice when you're building your battle maps. Now, in D&D, we talk about player agency all the time, how player agency and player choice is good, and railroading or taking away players' choice is bad. Now, I don't know exactly how true all of that is, but I do know that when you offer choices in combat, it can make for a more interesting combat. Now, you may be thinking, Well, don't players have plenty of choices in their combats? They can choose from all of their different spells, all of their different player abilities. They can attack a plethora of different monsters. It seems like there's a ton of choice in D&D combat. But my question is, how much of that choice is presented by the terrain itself? You can create an even more dynamic and changing and choice-driven combat by adding choices into the terrain. Here's an example. Say we take that fighter who needs to get across the chasm because they can only use close quarters combat. If we just give one way to get across the chasm, we haven't really presented that fighter with a choice. We've just told them what their action is going to be. If you want to fight this monster, you have to climb across the bridge, or whatever the option is that we present. But if we present multiple options to them, that means that they get to choose the strategically best choice in any given moment. Maybe there's a chandelier that they can swing across the chasm with, but it's dangerous. It's the fastest way across, but they could fall into the chasm. Alternatively, there's a safer way across, but it will take them much longer to go over to the bridge, cross the bridge, and then come back to the combat. So now they have to make a choice based on strategy and risk and reward. And when they make that choice and succeed, it will make them feel even more like the heroes than they would have otherwise. So hopefully these questions and these tips have been helpful for you in starting the process of making your own battle maps. Maybe you were stumped about what type of battle map you needed to make, and hopefully this was the exact inspiration you needed to get started. However, I know that this is not a comprehensive list of all the questions you could ask or all the tips that you could give for how to build a battle map. So if you have any interesting tips or creative questions about how to build battle maps, please put them down in the comments so that everyone else can see them, and maybe I'll learn something from them as well. Again, this is a community. It's the D&D community. We're supposed to be learning from one another, teaching one another, and hopefully all of our games will be enriched and improved because of it. But until then, my name is Zach Dyson. This has been Dungeon Master Design. Thank you all for watching.